morning, everyone, and welcome. Yesterday evening, you were welcomed by Dean O'Hara, and this morning by my esteemed colleague, Jerry Bradley, and please permit me to add my voices to theirs in welcoming you to Notre Dame University. And if I may speak, although I'm only a visiting professor here, if I may speak as a priest for a moment and extend a pastoral welcome to you. It's the University of Our Lady, and for those of us who have Catholic faith, she is, of course, a special exemplar of the human possibilities and hence of human dignity. The fact that I'm free to stand here and make a statement like that, we're keenly aware as members of the Federalist Society, is protected, guaranteed by the First Amendment of our federal Constitution. And we have two very interesting speakers this morning to talk to us about religious freedom in the context of human dignity. Our format is a bit different than it has been so far. We've been having panel discussions, of course, and now we turn to a debate format. And I'm going to introduce the speakers to you in terms of the order of their presentations. First, Mr. Kevin Seamus Hasson. Mr. Hasson has, of course, specialized in religious freedom for almost 2 decades now. He began his career as an attorney with the prestigious firm of Williams & Conley in Washington, D.C. He's also served as an attorney advisor to the United States Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel, where he was a chief advisor to President Reagan and his administration on church-state issues. I'm happy to say that in 1985, he graduated magna cum laude from this Notre Dame Law School. He also holds a master's degree in theology from this university, and indeed took his undergraduate degree here. In the common parlance of Notre Dame, I'm told that makes him a triple domer, and that is not what it might appear to seem, not a type of fast food or a wager at a racetrack, but rather here means that he is thrice blessed.
And saw 56 home games.
And he hopes to attend a home game this afternoon at 1 o'clock, so we have to stay in with the time frame here. His worthy opponent in the debate this morning is the Reverend Barry Lynn, well known nationally as a commentator on church-state issues. Reverend Lynn is, of course, the executive director of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, a position he's held since 1992. In addition to his work as an activist and a lawyer in the civil liberties field, he's an ordained minister of the United Church of Christ, which offers him a unique perspective on church-state issues. As an accomplished speaker and lecturer, Reverend Lynn has appeared frequently on television and radio broadcasts to offer his analysis of First Amendment issues. He began his professional career working at the National Office of the United Church of Christ, including a 2-year stint as legislative counsel for the church's office in Washington, D.C. From 1984 to 1981, he was legislative counsel for the Washington office of the American Civil Liberties Union. Reverend Lynn earned his law degree from the Georgetown University Law Center in 1978. In addition, he received his theology degree from Boston University School of Theology in 1973. Mr. Hasson and Reverend Lynn have debated before, and as a witness to one of those debates, I can tell you it was an intelligent discussion of issues on which there can be considerable disagreement between two gentlemen, and I expect nothing less than that this morning. Our format is as follows. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to speak. That will be followed by a rebuttal period, 3 minutes each, and then in the remaining time, we will open it up to questions from the floor. So without further ado, Mr. Hasson.
Thank you. It's good to be back. When China imprisons Tibetan Buddhists simply for possessing a photo of the Dalai Lama, and the United States says this is an outrage against religious liberty, China responds, we're interfering in their internal affairs. Are they right? When Iran allows the Baha'i to be murdered with impunity simply because they're heretical Baha'i, and we say, this is an outrage against religious liberty, they say, you're interfering in our internal affairs. Are they right? When the Sudan allows animist and Christian children to be enslaved, literally enslaved, chattel slavery, simply for being animist and Christian children, we say, this is an outrage against religious liberty. They say, you're interfering in our internal affairs. Are they right? Are they right? It's terribly important to know the answer to the question. This is my daughter's basketball game. Find out about it later. Don't tell her I said that. It's terribly important to know the answer to the question, are they right? Because it's another way of saying, where does religious liberty come from? Now, where does religious liberty come from? This is the Federalist Society. We're a bunch of lawyers, we're a bunch of law students. It's the Constitution, stupid. Well, really? Is it really that simple? So if it is, I mean, the Constitution certainly makes religious liberty a legal right in America, codifies religious liberty in America. But if it's really that simple that it's the origin of religious liberty in America, then the answer to the question from China and Iran and Sudan is very simple too. Very troubling. The Chinese Constitution has Article 48, doesn't have a First Amendment. Article 48 is nice, even nicer if they enforce it, but it's still no First Amendment. Too bad for the Buddhists. Next case. Iran has nothing resembling a First Amendment, so much for the Baha'i. The Sudan has nothing resembling a rule of law. Christians and animists just take their lumps. We don't say that. And the reason we don't say that is for the same reason we held trials in Nuremberg after World War II. There are certain things you may not do to a human being, even if it's legal. Even if your legislature has gone mad and said that you can kill Jews, you may not kill Jews. For the same reason, you may not persecute people on the basis of their religious belief, even if your law doesn't say that you can't. Now, why is that? Why do we recognize that right when the Chinese Constitution doesn't? Why are we not interfering in their internal affairs? Human dignity. There are certain things you may not do to a human being, even if it's legal. It violates their dignity. Well, fair enough. Religious liberty comes from human dignity. Where does human dignity come from? It's also important to know the answer to that question. Because if you get human dignity wrong, and you're going to say it's the basis of religious liberty, you're going to wind up with a right that's all misshapen. Just as Thomas Jefferson, on the day he said all men are created equal, was a slave owner. I thought I turned this on. We should take the battery out. There. I'll throw it the next time. Jefferson, on the day he wrote all men are created equal, was a slave owner. The day he died, he was a slave owner. He got the principle right that human rights followed from human nature. He got the human nature all wrong. The big question is, where does human dignity come from? I stand in a long tradition when I argue that human dignity comes from the quintessence of the human person. What it is that makes us most human is what gives us our dignity. What's that? Our intellect and our free will. We're born free and smart, and therefore we're born restless. Our intellects always search for truth. We want to know the truth about everything. We want to know the truth about aerodynamics. We want to know the truth about football statistics. We want to know the truth about everything. We're restless. We want to know more. At the same time, we hunger for goods. We're restless in search of things that are good, things that our will can choose, that are good, that are even better than they were the day before yesterday. We always look for ever more profound truths, ever better goods, ever more sublime beauties. It is the way we are made. Through it all, we thirst for transcendence. We want to seek an ultimate good. We want to know an ultimate truth. We want to contemplate an ultimate beauty that lies far beyond the horizons of ourselves. We want to be satisfied in our search. So we hunger for truth. We hunger for goodness. But we don't experience it just as a hunger, just as a thirst. We also experience it as a duty, because we have something else that's quintessentially human, and that's our conscience. The conscience is that interior voice that nags at us sometimes, instructs us sometimes. The voice we have to obey if we're going to retain our integrity. We experience our conscience telling us we must search for truth, and we must embrace the truth that we think we found, even if it turns out we were wrong. We experience our conscience commanding us to embrace the truth, to love the good that we come across. And again, we seek transcendence. We seek it in an ultimate sense. Now this creature, this truth-seeking, good-loving, conscience-driven creature, is by definition a very noble creature. And it's this nobility that gives us our dignity. Dignity is an immunity from coercion. Because we're driven by our conscience, and because we must obey our conscience, and because we seek the truths and love the good, no other human being can coerce us, telling us what is ultimately true, what is ultimately good, and how it is we should embrace the ultimate truth and the ultimate good. Now at the margin, of course, there are exceptions. Neo-Aztecs can't sacrifice people, and so forth and so on. But we're not talking about at the margins. In embracing this good, and embracing this truth that our conscience thinks we found, the final part of our human dignity comes into place. And that's that we're social creatures. We're born for community. We can live alone if we really have to, but we don't like it. Solitary confinement is one of our worst punishments. We always seek friendship and community and witnesses to all the great events of our lives. They're personal, intensely personal. They're not entirely private. We don't smuggle babies home from the hospital. We have chris's and baptisms, showers. We don't come of age in secret. We have bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs and confirmations and coming out parties. We don't marry in secret, typically. We don't elope. We spend enormous amounts of time figuring out how to spend outrageous sums of money and outlandish ceremonies. Unless we've murdered somebody, we don't sneak off in the dead of night to dispose of the body in a landfill. We gather together in funerals to weep together. We do all these things together because we don't live alone. For the same reason we don't believe alone. We don't believe alone because we don't live alone. Believers do it in public. My bumper sticker. And make a fortune out of it. You believe, so you just got it, didn't you? We believe, so we paint animals on prehistoric cave walls. We believe, so we spend generations building cathedrals in the midst of modest villages in medieval Europe. We believe, so we gather to light candles in electronically illuminated buildings that are perfectly well lit to begin with. We don't believe alone because we don't live alone. Our human dignity sends us on a search for truth, a search for the good. Our conscience says we must do it, we must embrace it. And part of embracing it is embracing it publicly. So far, I suspect Barry and I don't disagree that much. So let me throw him some red meat. In a place like America, not believing alone is always intertwined with a public culture. If our government were simply the night watchman of libertarian fame, all it did was run a post office, run the military, and little else. There wouldn't be much of a public culture that wasn't entirely civil society. Nativity scenes would be a non-issue. Menorahs would be a non-issue. But because we have a comprehensive public culture that declares everything from National Catfish Day to National Jukebox Week to be designated days, and I'm not making those up, it is peculiar to attempt a comprehensive culture that resolutely says nothing about the human search for transcendence. And saying nothing is not actually being silent. Saying nothing is saying something very profound. The human quest for transcendence is at best an optional hobby. It's lying to us about the very nature that gives us our dignity in the first place and gives us our religious liberty in the first place. So the Becket Fund commercial. The Becket Fund did something a couple years ago to try and change that. We sent a letter unsolicited to the mayors of the 400 largest cities in America saying, here is the law of nativity scenes and menorahs. You abide by it and put up a nativity scene or menorah as part of your cultural celebration of Christmas and Hanukkah and are sued by Barry or anybody else, we'll defend you for free. If, on the other hand, you refuse a private group's permit to put up a private nativity scene or menorah under circumstances where other private groups get to put up other private things, we will sue you. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah. Becket. So we got 23 requests for help, and we, thank God, won them all. But my favorite one, the one I'll tell you about in a second, was Jersey City, New Jersey. Jersey City is ethnically and culturally the most diverse city per capita in the United States. There are some 36 ethnicities that live in Jersey City in significant numbers. Under then Mayor Brett Schindler, there were daily flag raisings of different ethnicities. There were different celebrations of this, celebrations I'd never heard of. There was a Grand Pagwa Parade. I was halfway through the discovery period before I discovered that the Grand Pagwa Parade was religious. I had to turn over the documents. Turns out the Grand Pagwa Parade celebrates the Hindu Festival of Lights, something else I didn't even know existed. In the midst of all the parades going back and forth and the flags going up and down, there's a nativity scene for Christmas and there's a menorah for Hanukkah and there's also a proclamation of Ramadan. The ACLU sued. We thought this was a wonderful opportunity. We spent 2.5 years, went to the Third Circuit twice, finally won, and established, at least in dicta in the Third Circuit, that context can be temporal as well as spatial. Not just how far the jumbo candy cane is from the baby Jesus. It's what else happens during the year. What would the time-lapse photographer catch? And that's an important distinction because it's not just the litigator's way of worming around a constitutional rule he disagrees with. It's a way of saying religion belongs in culture, religious expression belongs in culture, from all traditions, because of human conscience, because of religious liberty. In this sense, religion and culture looks a lot like, in my view, ethnicity and culture. The Equal Protection Clause has the same standard for ethnic distinctions that the Establishment Clause makes for religious distinctions. Yet we don't have Anglophiles suing to block St. Patrick's Day parades. Every February when the courts aren't clogged with people, European Americans objecting to African American History Month. The reason is simple. Everybody knows better. Everybody knows the St. Patrick's Day parade is not an Irish supremacist plot. Nobody really feels threatened by African American History Month. It should be the same way with religion and culture, as a function of human dignity. I'm running out of time, so let me sum up by saying, religious liberty follows from human dignity. Human dignity follows from our intellect and our will, our conscience, and our sense of community. And that's why, even though it's legal in China to imprison the Tibetan Buddhists, it's wrong. Even why in Iran it's legal to look the other way when the Baha'i are murdered, it is wrong. Even though it's legal in Sudan to enslave animists and Christians, it is wrong. And it is also wrong in America. In addition to being illegal, it's more commercials, for the Clinton administration to have ordered its military chaplains not to preach against one of the Clinton's vetoes. It was wrong in America for Newark, New Jersey, not to allow its Muslim police officers to grow beards when other cops got to grow beards for other reasons. It was not only illegal, it was wrong for Trumbull, Connecticut, not to allow the Knights of Columbus nativity scene on the courthouse steps. And it was not only illegal, it was wrong for Cypress, California 6 months ago to try to condemn a church's property so they could sell it to Costco and get it back on the tax rolls. Four favorite Becket Fund greatest hits. It was wrong in addition to being illegal. Well, could I sue in those cases by saying human dignity has been violated? I wish. And if Madison had gotten one of his other amendments through the Congress, maybe I could today, but I can't. Human dignity is a measure of religious liberty, shows us to what we must aspire. Establishment Clause, the Free Exercise Clause, the Equal Protection Clause, and the Oaths Clause, and the Religious Test Clause, the religious liberty clauses of the Constitution are the law with their limitations. That's what we have to sue under. The human dignity as a basis for religious liberty points the way to which we must aspire. Thank you.
Good morning. When I told one of my colleagues that I was coming to speak to a Federalist Society conference, she said, "Oh, good, you can talk to the entire future federal judiciary all at the same time." But she was being sarcastic. Now, off and on throughout my professional career, I've not only done the things you've been told about, but I've also hosted talk radio shows for about 2 years with Pat Buchanan for NBC Radio, and even now once a week, a kind of weekly confab with Colonel Oliver North every Friday. One of the reasons that talk show hosts on the entertainment ladder are just one step above circus clowns who allow themselves to be shot out of cannons is because we are constantly talking to and interviewing people who are different. And I mean oddly different. I remember talking to a guy some years ago who wanted to prove the existence of God to anyone who would listen, apparently, including myself. And I did listen. He said that the proof of it, in his judgment, was that in so many cultures, when a colleague sneezes, you automatically say, "God bless you." I am not making that up. Now, it seems to me Augustine had a more complex theory about the proof of the existence of God, but I think I've forgotten it. So, luckily also today, we do not have to resolve the question of the existence of God in order to talk about the issue before us, which is, does religious liberty flow inexorably from human dignity, and where does that come from? Now, I happen to work for an organization that I am proud to say contains all kinds of people, from born-again evangelical Christians to professional atheists and everybody in between. Americans United for Separation of Church and State does not have a theology, but it does hold to the principle that the social order works best and most ethically when it is built on a foundation of a decent distance between the institutions of government and those of religion. Americans United is sometimes referred to as a niche organization because it has a reasonably large membership which is terribly interested in a few core issues and principles, albeit for a variety of reasons. Ironically, virtually all of our members agree about the importance, that is to say, the significance of religion in culture, either because some form of it is believed to be the way in which people gain eternal salvation, or on the other side, because it interjects a dangerous, irrational idea into policy debates which ought to be seeking solutions to problems in the here and now, not caring very much about whether there is a here and after. So for good or ill, our members do believe that religion is best left free of all government encumbrances and free of all governmental support. It's also a nearly universally held belief in our organization that the protection of non-believers is an essential component of general religious liberty for everyone else. I do think that religion has a very special niche in our Constitution as well. After all, there are two very specific references to it in the Constitution. Article 6 prohibits any religious test for public office. Article 1, of course, of the Bill of Rights says, in 16 words, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. There are very few other human enterprises that in fact get that much ink in the Constitution. Not economics, not employment policy, not the rest of the culture, not even catfish. I didn't know about that catfish week until Seamus told us. Clearly, religion is in some kind of special category in the Constitution. Indeed, the founders of the country quite clearly had a fairly all-encompassing view of religion. They knew a lot about it, about their own if they had it, and they were also quite familiar with non-Christian religions, including Hinduism and Islam, as well as the rights of non-believers that are usually referred to in early writings affectionately, I'm sure, as infidels. A few weeks ago on the radio, Colonel North and I were discussing the purported right to drive suburban utility vehicles, specifically Humvees. Personally, I'm kind of on Arianna Huffington's side on that issue. I don't know that this is such a hot idea. These creatures that seem to emerge out of the backyards of almost every house in my neighborhood. A caller, though, took great umbrage at my claim that the government should have the power to just ban vehicles that don't get a certain gas mileage or that weighed over a certain tonnage. He was very good-natured, but he was quite indignant as he rattled off for me what he considered to be the essence of human freedom. It was to drive his SUV, smoke cigars, and drink beer. When you're the guy. Yeah, I kind of threw in the Victoria's Secret fashion show watching that. He kind of assumed that was included in the nation. I said, wait a minute, sir. Would you at least concede that there's some other freedoms worth talking about, like the freedom of religion? And he said, well, of course, there's some that are more important, like what church you go to. You can go to any one you want. And I thought I had had a eureka moment. I didn't want to push it, so I immediately went on to another call. But the truth is, every rational person understands that there are some distinctions, that even if you think you do have a right to smoke cigars in your SUV, it may not be as important as certain other rights. And I think we all do that. And in fact, I think as rational people, we ought to do that. The right to believe and to practice a religious faith, if you choose to do that, if you choose further to exhort others to come to your viewpoint, that matters a great deal. And ironically, it does matter, as Seamus suggested, particularly because it matters that you can be wrong about it. If we were all born with some innate knowledge of what was really going on out there, we would not be truly free. To be human is to be able to err with divine forgiveness to follow, as in to err is human, to forgive divine. Curiously, though, if we have this human dignity that we possess, and it does matter, then religious choices ought to matter more than a lot of others. And to that extent, the Constitution got it right when it granted individuals the maximum right to practice their faith, along with a collateral right for others not to help the practice of their faith or any faith with which they might find objection. Now, if my taxes were going to be used to build a road from Washington, D.C. to Richmond, Virginia, I could think of a lot of reasons why I might not like it. I could say it's costly, or it's ugly, or it's a lot of other bad things. I could get all hot under the collar about it. But I'll get over that concern unless perhaps the road is going to be built right through my house. Otherwise, I'll just live with it. It's the same thing as so many other controversies around the country. What do they do to the elderly tax credit? It matters, but it doesn't matter as much as many other things, particularly the core of conscience and religious freedom. Those things have a lasting effect on us. So if the government were to embrace a particular religion, which is not your own, by hiring ministers or building churches or sending out missionaries, teaching that faith in schools to your children, even if it's not the faith that you're teaching at home, that would have, I'd argue, a much more long-lasting and disturbing effect than almost anything government does. That would cut to the core of who you are. It would trample on one of the few things that really does matter the most, and that is religious liberty as a core component of human dignity. So Seamus and I agree about a couple of things, as he certainly indicated. We agree about some specific cases. I'm sure, or at least I believe, I'm sure that he and I would agree that if you're a member of the Christian Science community, at least if you're an adult member, you have the right to tell the government, no thank you, I'm not taking your health care, even if I have cancer. If you are a member of the Sikh faith and your children must wear a ceremonial dagger to school, as long as you agree to have it permanently sheathed so that it can't be pulled out in school, and that's literally what happens in most of these cases, that's a good accommodation of and a responsible reaction to a claim of religious freedom. So we agree with all of those, and maybe most of you agree with those. But there are some other big categories of controversies where we do not agree, and one of them was overlooked almost entirely in the 15 or so minutes that Seamus was up here. And that is the question of paying for other people's religious views. As in the voucher decision that came down from the Supreme Court on a 5-4 vote this past summer. The court's majority upheld the program in Cleveland as one in which religious schools get funding by virtue of the autonomous individual decisions, they said, of a large number of parents. This is very far, said the majority, from any kind of direct funding of religion. To which the members of my organization would say that is absolute nonsense. It makes no difference whatsoever whether the money ends up at the St. Mary's School or the Islamic Academy by virtue of the choice of a parent or by the decision of distribution made by a city council. It only matters that their money has gone to preserve a religious institution, the educational wing of a church, with which they have profound disagreements theologically or ethically. That, to me, is coercive. Coercive. Their money is going to promote a faith which is, in their view, and they would fill in the blanks differently, wrong-headed or dangerous, or leading people to damnation, or perhaps just right but not in need of the corrupting influence of the state's funds and power. At least it seems to me that when you give money to a wrong public works project, you might argue it is coercive. They're taking it and you don't want it. That can't be as significant a problem as taking that same dollar and using it to promote someone else's religious faith and commitment. That's got to be worse. At least it is in my hierarchy of values. And that's really what Thomas Jefferson meant when he wrote back in 1777 in the Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom in the Commonwealth of Virginia, that to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. For me, it's an essential part of what it is to be a human individual and to respect human dignity, that we can make bad choices, even choices that might damn us to eternity, for eternity. However, it doesn't follow that governments can make the same claim. Governments should not be in the business of sorting out theological truth or falsity. They shouldn't be deciding what religions are better or worse than any others. They shouldn't even be deciding what role or what significance religion should have in the culture. They've got to be strictly neutral in regard to this one matter, and that is religion. A government agency or actor cannot fund any religion or all religion. It can't display the symbols of some or all religions, even if it includes, as some new displays do, the atom, which according to some secular humanists is their symbol, although other free thinkers, to be expected, vigorously argue that the atom is a silly symbol for free thinking. They can't embrace one or all. They've got to be neutral in regard to the whole topic. Because whenever you help religion, and I use that phrase very advisedly, you inevitably lead to the corruption of the integrity of that faith and put at risk the dignity of the adherents of that faith. President Bush, in my view, as you may learned, if you've ever seen me before, I think says a lot of very foolish things. One of the most foolish is this comment, which he repeats often: governments cannot give us hope. Of course they can. His just doesn't. He usually says this when he's talking about promoting his faith-based initiative. That's where the so-called armies of compassion get their marching orders from the church, but their rations from the taxpayer. What a path we are starting down. Apparently there are people, and I suspect Seamus is one of them, who actually thinks that somehow human dignity is involved in this idea of giving money to the missions of religious organizations. Human dignity now means that you get federal funds for your mission program. If you write good grant proposals, you fit some suitable ethnic or religious profile for would-be A-list voters in the next election cycle. That seems to be happening. And you claim you will only be religious for part of the time or in part of your building that happens to be coextensive with the percentage of funding you get from public sources. Brother, what a long road down we have gone. Adherents to any religion, no matter how desperately impoverished, have very serious problems if they think that religious freedom and or human dignity will be advanced by seeking government funds for the missions that they choose to operate. There are another set of cases that Seamus has alluded to, and those are a lot of these public display cases, and I just want to comment on it briefly. In truth, a lot of these controversies about public events that arguably are religious, we see this spectacle, and I think we even saw a little of it this morning, where the parties arguing for religious inclusion somehow argue that the expression isn't really religious anymore because it's become a part of the culture or the heritage of our country. Why is it not unconstitutional to keep "In God We Trust" on coins? No court's ever said you should take it off. Opined one court, it doesn't matter that it's there because it has, quote, lost its religious significance. "In God We Trust" has lost its religious significance. Is that a good thing for those of us who believe in God? I don't think so. That is not a step forward. The Family Research Council praised a decision by a divided panel of the Sixth Circuit, which upheld the use of the phrase "with God all things are possible" as the Ohio state motto. The legal analyst over there, Miriam Moore of the group, the Family Research Council, told the Washington Times, and yes, I do read it, that it was, after all, a pretty innocuous phrase: "with God, all things are possible." What does that even mean? It sounds like an update of the three-time denial by Judas that he even knew who Jesus was as the centurions kept coming to town. It's not religious. Of course it is. When you make an affirmation about God in a public place, you are affirming the existence of, significance of, and presumed continued interest in the topic. When any kind of promotion of government is done by government fiat, by government financial support, with or without parental conduits, whether it's the government's selection of a theological viewpoint, it is an assault on the very voluntary acceptance of religion or rejection of religion, which is for some of us the very heart of human dignity. It's similarly important that we did create a constitutional system that does allow, in this country alone, 2,000 different religions to practice, tens of millions of Americans to choose no spiritual path at all, and for all of us to get along in relative harmony. I think if we get to a point where we trifle with the balance struck 200 years ago, we will be stuck under a cloud that contains the very gravest risks to the one thing that Seamus and I do agree about, and that is that religious liberty is indeed a core of human dignity. I don't want us to take that risk. Thank you very much.
Notice what he didn't say. He didn't say where religious liberty comes from, and he didn't say where human dignity comes from. And that's why he's confused. Jefferson, in his Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom, which Barry likes and I like, began with the phrase, "Almighty God hath created the mind free," and makes in his own way an argument for religious liberty based on freedom of conscience, freedom of the intellect, freedom of the will. He calls it a natural right, Jefferson does. At the end of the preamble, he says, now I can't bind future legislatures from not repealing this, I know that, but then he just sort of tries to shame them into not doing it. It says, but they should know that if they do, they're repealing something in abrogation, or they'll be abrogating a natural human right. Jefferson, in his own way, agreed on where religious liberty comes from, where human dignity comes from. Barry doesn't. That's why he's a little confused today. What's he confused about? And by the way, Jefferson also thought it was the most central of human rights. And, for precisely the right reason. It's the most central of human rights, not because it's the biggest one, not because it comes first in the First Amendment, but because human dignity is the source of all human rights. Human dignity is based on freedom of the will and the intellect, and this is the one that comes closest to that. This is the core. This is the one that proves all the others must be there. So what's Barry confused about? Barry's confused about whether religion and culture is really religious. Of course it's religious. Of course nativity scenes on the courthouse steps are religious. Makes no sense if they're not. Makes no sense if the menorah is some kind of candelabra. That's my whole point. It's crazy for the government to pretend in late December that it doesn't know why people are celebrating. It's crazy for them to pretend that, Ramadan is some kind of dieting phase. The people are being religious and are expressing themselves culturally, and the state is not wrong to reflect the culture of the civil society that it serves, as long as it's reflecting faithfully all the cultures that it serves, as long as there's a nativity scene and a menorah, and a proclamation of Ramadan, and a grand festival, grand Pagwa parade, if you're in Jersey City. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not that we're saying they're all true. They all can't be true. It doesn't make any sense. We're not saying that none of them are true. We're saying that everybody has the right to be wrong in public. As for Justice O'Connor's theory that in God we trust is only okay because it's ubiquitous and because everyone knows you don't really mean it anyway. Every time the Supreme Court argument chamber or session begins with, "Oyez, oyez, God save the United States in this honorable court," I'm always tempted to yell, "Amen." And after I get out of jail on contempt, say, "Now then, Justice O'Connor, is it unconstitutional now?" Of course it's religious. Why does it belong there? Because religion is a public good. Why is religion a public good? Because religion is a human good, and humans are public people. We do what we do in public. The same thing is true about Barry's confusion about helping religion. Of course the government shouldn't give Baptists what it doesn't give Catholics, what it doesn't give Jews, or what it doesn't give Sikhs, what it doesn't give Scientologists, God forbid. What's right about vouchers, maybe lousy policy, I don't know. But what's right about vouchers constitutionally is that the government is empowering people to express themselves with their own money. And the same thing is true with voucher system and charitable choice as it is in schools. I'm out of time, but ask Barry about the Blaine amendments. See if he likes them.
Yes, I love the Blaine amendments. And number two, when you get put in jail for contempt, I'll see if I can find an ACLU lawyer to get you out. Comprehensive culture. Again, this is just such a fundamental problem between the two viewpoints you're hearing. The comprehensive culture does not mean that the United States of America has a right to make any judgments about one subject, only one subject, religion. See, we can make all kinds of economic judgments. That's why we're a capitalist society. It's not because it's in the Constitution. It's because it's one of the many choices we make and governments can make. We have elections to make political decisions and change politics, but we are supposed to remain strictly neutral about the one topic of religion. Make no law respecting and, that means touching upon the topic of religion. That's why it's different. Why, by the way, does the government have to note at the end of December that there is, for example, Christmas? That's why we have shopping malls. They tell us you would have to literally be living in a cave, possibly with Osama bin Laden, not to understand that it is Christmas toward the end of December. government does not need to embrace it, enhance it, or put up the religious symbols of that or any other religious faith that happens to be promoted amongst its believers at about the same time of the year. Final point, the chaplaincy. Those are very tough questions. Should a chaplain of the United States military be able to speak about anything, including controversial issues like abortion, even when told by his superiors not to do so? Well, there is a strong part of me that says, you know, he ought to be able to say on that Sunday service anything he wants. But there's a slightly stronger argument that says, if you take the money from the government in the first place, do not be surprised if it comes with a few strings, one of them attached to your tongue. Thank you.
We open the floor now to questions. And we'll start here on the left.
Hi, I'm Charles Barzin from the University of Virginia. Two quick questions. One is, I was wondering, Reverend Lynn, whether, in what way you mentioned neutrality, if the government, if the Constitution protects religion, as you say, from all the other different ways one could discriminate, is it possible for it to remain neutral with respect to religion and no religion? And secondly, I'm curious, both of your thoughts on the Pledge of Allegiance.
Well, you know, I think it can be neutral because I think we, in common experience, are neutral about a wide variety of things as individuals. For example, until you raised this question, I had not thought today, do I like dogs or cats better? I mean, I just had no opinion about it. I didn't think about it. It wasn't part of the decisions or the thoughts I was having driving from Chicago. So the point is, I think you can be neutral. You can say, this is not the place in which we will talk about matters of faith and conscience because it is the public school or because it is the public courthouse. So I think you can do that, and I think we all do that on a regular basis. Of course, in 1954, when the Congress passed a law that merely added two words, under God, which we all agree is religious language, to a secular Pledge of Allegiance, they turned it into essentially a religious creedal statement that was a quintessential violation of the First Amendment. And I'm finally just terribly delighted this summer when at least two members of a three-member panel of the Ninth Circuit finally got around to recognizing that something had gone awry in 1954.
What happened in 1954 in context is the Knights of Columbus put up the Congress to adding the words under God. Not because, they didn't say under the Catholic God, as a Catholic organization in Barry's view of the world might have done. They did it as a counterpoint to the Soviet Union, to say that America, and this is well documented, that America was unlike the Soviet Union. America did not have the state as the highest good. The America saw the state as a good that was subject to yet a higher law. That is a terribly important thing in a democracy. To say that adding under God is unconstitutional and is a violation of the First Amendment is basically to say you can't read the Declaration of Independence in public schools. Because the pungency of the under God is no greater than all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator. Now, should someone have the right not to say it individually? Of course. It's Barnett, and Barnett was correctly decided. But Barnett did not ban the teacher from leading the Pledge of Allegiance, just required that kids who couldn't say it in conscience be excused. And parenthetically, this has always been the case of the Pledge of Allegiance. For Jehovah's Witnesses, the driving force behind the Barnett case in the first place, saluting the flag is an act of idolatry. The whole thing is religious to them. So adding under God does not create any more of it. Might create the same issue for different people, but doesn't change the issue that was always there.
The floor on the right, please, Eric.
Eric Kniffen, University of Notre Dame. This question is primarily for Reverend Lynn. These debates are always a turf war, and they tend to be a turf war over our history and over the word neutrality. Your position, as I understand it, rests on the idea that there is a neutral worldview with regard to religion. In the Christian tradition, since St. Augustine, it has been clearly understood that there is not a neutral worldview with regard to God, with regard to religious truths. And to say that religion is ultimately inappropriate in the public square is a theology. And so how do you answer that? How do you couch this idea that the government can be neutral in light of the fact that neutrality involves necessarily saying that religion is inappropriate in this sphere?
Well, I thought it was going to be an even harder question until you use those last three words, in this sphere. That's all the Constitution's saying. It of course doesn't say that we can have or are expected to have a country in which there is no discussion of religion. That's what the Free Exercise Clause is all about. What it does say, in my reading of both history, and of course it tends to become often a historical battle here, but it says that in the context of the promotion of ideas by government, by its agents and organizations and agencies, it must be neutral. And I understand, obviously, that Christianity is not a neutral worldview. Obviously not. But I think it does recognize, the Constitution recognizes that it is possible to simply be silent on an issue without being hostile to it. Silence is not always hostility. It can be, but it's certainly not when it comes to choosing amongst religions or no religion in the context of a public school event or what we say or argue in a court of law.
Follow up quickly. It's not just a bad theology, it's bad anthropology. The fight over religion in public life is not primarily a fight over who God is, it's primarily a fight over who we are. Whether we come with a built-in religious impulse in us or not. And for the government to have a comprehensive culture and to be silent all the time on anything transcendent is to say that we don't. That's to lie to kids in particular, it's to lie to adults as well about who we really are. That's what's wrong with it.
Balcony left, please.
Hi, I'm Graham Mealy from Harvard Law School. I have a question for Reverend Lynn. Do you think that the Establishment Clause, at the time it was first drafted, was meant to apply to the states? I mean, its phrasing as well as its intent says Congress shall pass no law. And I have heard that that was intended to restrain Congress from making laws respecting establishment of religion, including banning states from establishing their own religions.
Oh, you're right. I mean, clearly, if it wasn't for the 14th Amendment, we would not be applying the principles of the First Amendment to the states. But I think you'd be hard-pressed today, although I still have to argue about this sometimes, that the 14th Amendment does apply the guarantees of the Bill of Rights gradually, as it turns out, over the course of 50 years to the states through the doctrine of incorporation. So no, you're right. That was the original intent, has to go only to the extent that we can figure out what it was, to the context, the actual product they were creating, this deep division without hostility, but a division between the organizations of government and those of religion. But it certainly was not intended at the time to apply to the states.
No, it clearly wasn't. Jefferson's second inaugural says as much. But the interesting thing about the 14th Amendment is it's effectively amended the First Amendment without changing its language, which is to say it took something that was a federalism thing in the first place and suddenly applied it against the states without changing the words that the law uses. And how to give meaning to an amendment that doesn't change the words has been the problem we've had ever since.
Balcony right.
Thank you. My name is Austin Bramwell. I'm at Harvard Law School, and my question is for Mr. Hasson. You spoke very eloquently about human restlessness, but famously, liberal democracy, it is said, cures this very restlessness by inculcating a moral freedom or an easygoing relativism, according to which no view of transcendence is better than any other. My question is, can a polity which refuses or fails to exclude views which it finds inconsistent with its view of the good really satisfy this human restlessness and longing to seek the good?
What a great question. I don't know if you meant to say, can the polity actually satisfy the human restlessness?
I'm sorry, can a polity, if that fails to exclude certain views, be said to satisfy a human need for restlessness, given that it can't realize any notion of the good life for that polity?
I would argue that no polity, as a polity, can ever satisfy human restlessness. However, pluralism, let me get at it this way. Religious pluralism is a relatively new human phenomenon in history. We're not terribly good at it yet. But there are only three possible models. One model is the jihad model. One model is I call it the secondhand smoke model. And the third model is the Jersey City model. The jihad model says we're going to use the powers of the state to impose one worldview on everybody else. It's wrong, it's immoral, always and everywhere. It's the secondhand smoke model, Barry's favorite model, says no, religion is so dangerous that you can imbibe it in private, but don't do it in public, and it's the government's job to protect you from it in train stations. The problem with that is that it doesn't succeed in saying nothing about religion. It says something about religion. It says religion is not a human endeavor. It basically is an equal opportunity oppressor to people of all faiths. The only remaining option, and it was the option actually in More's Utopia, is to let 1,000 flowers bloom while scrupulously not doing two things. One, not picking one, not putting the government's thumb on the scale as to which one is true, and not doing the other thing of saying none of them are true or all of them are true, to avoid the relativism of saying, well, polytheism and monotheism and atheism are all different paths up the same mountain. They're not. So what comes out of it, I think, in my worldview, is that there is a truth, not a doubt, but a truth about the human person that grounds religious liberty. And the truth about the human person is that men were created freely to seek the truth about God. That there is a truth about him, and not all things are same paths up or different paths up the same mountain, but people have the right to be wrong, not just kind of mushy relativism, but literally the right to be wrong about who God is in public. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Let me just make one comment, and that is, again, in the same way that neutrality is not hostility, it also isn't a declaration of relativism. It is neutrality, which takes no position on the matter of whether religions are relative or there are many paths to the truth, because that is not a relevant question for government to ask. Similarly, the secondhand smoke model, which I've just learned about, where Seamus says religion, it says religion is not a human endeavor. That's not what that model says, if that model even exists and is a good one. All it says is that for government, it is not an endeavor. It is not a governmental endeavor. What's so difficult about that distinction?
The floor on the right, please.
Hello, I'm Lance Turlington. I'm a student at the University of Oklahoma. I'm also an Army captain, and I'm also a fundamentalist Christian, deployed to at least one ugly place, and I was glad I had a chaplain. If he were not permitted to discuss issues of sexual morality with me, or to discuss the fact that my Creator knew me in the womb, or to discuss any other thing that he wanted to discuss with me, then I would be denied pastoral care, and that would be an infringement on my free exercise. You would be telling soldiers or other government employees that they cannot exercise their religion if they take a paycheck. But that's not what bothers me. Here's my question. What bothers me is that we've so far had a debate. It does bother me too. That's not why I'm standing here. What's more significant is we've had an enormous, interesting debate on religious freedom without discussing God or our Creator as a source of human dignity. So I would ask all three of you gentlemen, especially Reverend Coughlin, if you believe that human dignity comes from our Creator. And if so, why can't we talk about that?
I'm not a participant in the debate. I certainly do believe it. I don't know if the others want to respond.
I do too. I do too. And in saying that religious liberty comes from human dignity, which is based on freedom of choice, intellect, and conscience, a Christian like me can hear echoes of created in the image and likeness of God. An observant Jew can hear the same echoes. But we want an account of religious liberty that works for people who are not observant Christians or believing Christians or observant Jews, and an anthropologically based one instead of a theologically based one. It starts in the same place, but just doesn't begin with who put it there, I think is the best way to go. And Vatican II took a similar approach explicitly. Their Declaration of Religious Freedom, it's on our website. If you ever want to read it, it's 22 pages. You can read it on an airplane sometime. Has two parallel arguments for religious liberty. One is God told us it's there. The second is we can see it. They did that on purpose so that the church could have a dialogue with the modern world on a critically important subject. And the subtext is Archbishop Wojtyła, now John Paul II, wanted something he could ram down the throats of the Soviets, and he succeeded.
Yeah, I would, again, personally, I made my choice about where I think human dignity comes from, and I would have no different answer than the last, well, than either one of the rest of you. My question, though, is why in the world is this a relevant question to pose when you're thinking about whether governments are functioning to protect human dignity and religious freedom? Governments don't give it to us, but governments can certainly be structured in such a way as to maximize our expression of it. And that's exactly what I think is the marvel of this wonderful contribution the First Amendment has made to modern intellectual thought. It got it right because it said we're going to be neutral, we're not promoting one religion or any religion, but we certainly are going to allow the free exercise thereof. And I do agree, sir, that there are circumstances where you're in the middle of a jungle or a desert where you the only way you can accommodate a religious freedom is to have some paid official of government, a chaplain there. I'd just like to see in the places that are right where there are churches right next to Fort Dix, you know, that maybe it's not as essential that there be a paid chaplain there as there is if you're in the middle of Vietnam.
The floor on the left, please.
David Mulvihill, in-house counsel for LaSalle Bank Corporation in Chicago. My question is really for both speakers. I think, and Mr. Hasson alludes to the fact that there are certain principles fundamental to human dignity that happen to be codified in the major world religions, which shouldn't be stripped from the public square merely because of their religious association. Now, Reverend Lynn mentions that those who share his point of view want a decent distance between the institutions of government and religion for the protection of believers and non-believers. But at what point does Reverend Lynn's view of the protection of non-believers infringe on the free exercise rights of the people of faith? And where do we draw the line, and how is this determination neutral?
Of course non-believers have the same religious liberty believers have, because they have the same human dignity that believers have from exactly the same source. But nobody's got the right not to listen. Where an unbeliever's supposed right tramples upon the free exercise rights of somebody else is when someone comes along and says, you can't put up your nativity scene, your private nativity scene on the courthouse steps because it will offend me. That's not a right that the non-believer has. It's not that he has less religious liberty. The believer who's a Christian may object to the nativity scene on religious grounds just as much as the non-believer does. He doesn't have that right either.
Well, you know, again, we're mixing up two things. I will admit that I once did get a call from a guy who said that he was so disturbed about his neighbor's display on the lawn of a nativity scene. Could we do anything to get rid of it? And the answer is no. And of course, the answer should be no in the kind of system that we've created. But that's different than making an argument that if it happens to be a nativity scene on the steps of the courthouse, a passerby might get the clear and distinct impression that that courthouse was somehow related to that religious expression. That is not, everyone would not have that view. The fact is some people do have that view, and originally, remember, this whole issue of nativity scenes was fought not over the question of what private institutions could do, but whether governments could themselves, buy the baby Jesus, a couple of wise men, some sheep, and put them up every December 12th. That was the issue originally, and lots of people said, of course they can, of course they can't, and I think that we have to be very careful even with the so-called expression of everyone can put their own symbol up on the same courthouse step at the same time. Among other things, we'd have so many symbols eventually we couldn't even get in to pay our parking tickets.
We're very conscious of the time. I know there are many more questions, but lunch is waiting, so we're only going to have time for 2 more questions, one from each side of the balcony, starting with the left side.
Okay, I'm James Cardle, and I'm from the University of Notre Dame. And I'm curious, I'd like to ask the Reverend Lynn what the distinction is between giving school vouchers to kids in Cleveland or other places that are going to grade school and high school, and giving Pell Grants or GI Bill to college students that go to Notre Dame or BYU or some other sectarian place, or giving other federal money for health care, for care of old folks, for all kinds of other things that go to sectarian hospitals and other sectarian institutions. Why is he hostile to one, and maybe he's hostile to the others? I'm not sure, but I'd like to
well, I mean, I think
the distinction is.
Yeah, I think the easy one is the GI Bill, because the GI Bill to me represents delayed compensation for service to your country. Instead of paying you everything right now while you're doing the fighting, they're giving you something in reserve, and it's the same thing that you then have the right to use the money you get during your service. You can go out and directly contribute it to a church, or you can use the delayed compensation at a pervasively religious institution. I do have some problems with Pell Grants being used at pervasively sectarian institutions, but as even Justice Scalia has noted upon visiting several major, I don't think he was talking about this place, but other Catholic universities, he has not noticed that there is much Catholicism left. Now that might be, I don't know what he thinks is the cause. I think I know what is the cause. It's because the more money you take from government, the more secularized you become. You have to decide if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But I would like to stop Pell Grants going to pervasively sectarian colleges and universities to the extent they even exist anymore.
How about the health care?
I'm sorry, we'll have to move to the next question. You don't want to respond to that?
He's wrong.
Final question, please.
Ryan Hecker from Harvard Law School. I have a question for Mr. Lynn specifically. You say that you pretty much accept the position in many situations that there should be exceptions, such as a Sikh child being allowed to wear his sword in school. Now, I don't see then how you can possibly accept that given your line of argumentation. I would say then that what you're basically saying is that government needs to enforce some sort of active neutrality in order to allow for such exceptions. But isn't that action still active? And therefore, isn't government, by allowing some groups to have more rights than others, thereby violating the law, isn't that pretty much active participation in religion?
Well, that is a great question, and I don't write a lot of law review articles because I'm too busy being on talk radio, but I did write one once where I made that argument. I said essentially, the free exercise clause, when you really think about it, and the establishment clause have more than tension because they can arguably be in conflict. Of course, and I think the question becomes, what is I guess there are 2 issues. One of them most of you will clearly not agree with, and that is, what is the part of the producing First Amendment that is most in trouble at the moment? That is the danger that religion is being squashed by government, or that we're working too hard to preserve and protect and promote and pay for those religions we like. The other is just that something like wearing a ceremonial dagger to school or deciding not to get treatment for cancer, which is not a contagious disease, has so little effect on anyone else that government should just acknowledge the obvious right for people to engage in the conduct rather than have to write regulations about it, which they sometimes do, or litigate the matter. But at the edges, you're absolutely right. Whenever you guarantee to someone an option to opt out of something that applies to the rest of the people, you do in some small and subtle way, at least in a small and subtle way, encourage people who want to do the same thing to become a member of that faith. If you really want to carry a dagger to school, you're more likely, I guess, to become a Sikh in order to do it. And that is your argument, and it's a good one. I'm sorry you asked me the question. Now, I was hoping you'd ask him a question, and then I could just say, he's wrong, and then see if anybody would applaud. One person.
Barry, you obviously think the Establishment Clause forbids everything about religion that the Free Exercise Clause doesn't get down to requiring. And it's the only way you can possibly have a tension between the two of them. That's crazy. The Establishment Clause and the Constitution is law, and just like any other kind of law, it requires some things, forbids some things. It leaves a great many things completely alone. The Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause are both relatively small provisions to come nowhere near bumping into each other when they're properly interpreted. Establishment Clause is a lot like, in my view, a lot like the Third Amendment. It violates some very specific kind of government conduct that hasn't been seen in a very long time. The Free Exercise Clause, the Third Amendment says government troops shall not be quartered in private homes without the consent of the owners except during wartime.
You know what those calls were, Seamus? They were not about that was an announcement to call, you were being called by home, saying that people in blue United Nations uniforms were living in your basement. So don't ridicule the Third Amendment.
You got the wrong debate, Barry.
Just when things are getting good, we have to end this.